At my sister's MBA graduation, she made me sit in the back row like a stranger, even though I had sacrificed my own college dreams and worked 3 jobs to pay for her entire education. My name is Maya Chen, and what happened that day at the University of Oregon changed everything between us forever. But the real shock wasn't being relegated to the cheap seats. It was discovering what Jessica had been telling people about where her tuition money actually came from. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have seen it coming when the graduation invitation arrived addressed only to my parents. Not the Chen family like every other milestone event we'd celebrated. Just Robert and Linda Chen, plus 1 guest. When I called Jessica to ask about my seat, she laughed it off with that breezy tone she'd perfected over the years. "Oh, Maya, you know how limited the tickets are for MBA ceremonies. I can only bring immediate family." I stared at my phone, wondering when I'd stopped being her immediate family and started being an inconvenience. The morning of graduation dawned gray and drizzly, typical for Eugene in May. I'd driven down from Portland at 5 in the morning, my beat-up Honda struggling up the mountain passes while I nursed my 3rd cup of gas station coffee. I hadn't slept much the night before, partly from excitement and partly from that gnawing feeling in my stomach that something was off. Jessica had seemed distant during our phone calls leading up to graduation, cutting conversations short and always seeming distracted when I brought up the ceremony. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, navy blue with small white flowers, nothing fancy but the nicest thing I'd owned in years. It had taken me 3 weeks to save up the $60 from my tips at the coffee shop where I worked mornings, before heading to my main job at the marketing agency. I wanted to look like I belonged there, like I was proud to be her sister. I spent an extra 10 minutes that morning curling my hair and applying the lipstick I'd been saving for special occasions. The University of Oregon campus buzzed with activity as families in their Sunday best made their way toward Matthew Knight Arena. Parents clutched bouquets of flowers and professional cameras, while graduates in their black robes posed for pictures near the campus landmarks. I followed the crowd, checking my phone for Jessica's text about where to meet. When it finally came, the message was brief. "Running late, just head inside. See you after." I approached the arena entrance and handed my ticket to the student volunteer checking people in. She scanned it and gave me a polite smile before pointing toward a section that seemed impossibly far from the stage. "You'll be in section 314, all the way up there," she said, gesturing toward what I could only describe as the nosebleed seats. I looked around and noticed other families being directed to the lower sections, some even getting special reserved seating passes. My parents were nowhere to be seen. I climbed the concrete steps, my heels echoing in the vast space, passing row after row of excited families until I reached section 314. The view from up there made the stage look like a postage stamp. I could barely make out the faculty members taking their places, let alone identify individual graduates. An elderly gentleman sitting next to me noticed my confusion and leaned over with a kind smile. "First time at one of these ceremonies?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "They put all the extra tickets up here," he explained. "Family gets the good seats down there." Extra tickets. The words hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't family. I was extra. I spent the next hour watching through the arena's big screens as graduates filed in alphabetically. When Jessica's name was announced, I saw her walk across that stage in perfect focus on the Jumbotron, her smile radiant as she shook hands with the dean. She looked poised and confident, every inch the successful MBA graduate. I clapped along, with everyone else, my applause echoing in the upper reaches of the arena, where only a handful of other extra guests sat scattered among empty seats. After the ceremony, I made my way down to the reception area where graduates were meeting their families. The lobby buzzed with congratulations and photo sessions. I spotted Jessica immediately, surrounded by our parents, and what looked like a small group of her classmates and their families. She was laughing at something my father had said, her diploma held carefully in one hand, while my mother adjusted her graduation cap for what must have been the 20th photo. I approached the group slowly, waiting for a break in the conversation to congratulate her. But as I got closer, I heard something that stopped me cold. One of Jessica's classmates, a blonde woman in an expensive-looking dress, was asking about financing her education. "I'm so impressed that you worked your way through the program," she was saying to Jessica. "Starting your own consulting business while in school and paying your own tuition? That takes incredible discipline." Jessica's response made my blood run cold. "Well, you know how it is. When you really want something, you find a way to make it happen. I've always been pretty resourceful." She paused, then added with a modest shrug, "My parents helped a little, but mostly it was just me grinding it out, building my client base from scratch." I stood there frozen, listening to my sister take credit for sacrifices I'd made for 4 years. The consulting business she mentioned? That was my idea. My contacts from the marketing agency. My weekends spent building her website and managing her social media while she focused on her studies. The grinding it out? That was me working doubles, at the coffee shop. Me skipping meals to send her money for textbooks. Me deferring my own student loans so she could graduate debt-free. My mother spotted me first and waved me over with what looked like relief. "Maya, there you are. We were wondering where you'd gotten to." But before I could respond, Jessica turned and gave me a quick hug that felt more like a dismissal. "Thanks for coming, sis. I know it's a long drive from Portland." Then she immediately turned back to her classmates, effectively ending our interaction. One of the other graduates, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked at me with polite curiosity. "Are you in school too?" he asked. I opened my mouth to explain that I'd actually dropped out of Portland State 3 years ago to help pay for Jessica's education, but Jessica jumped in before I could speak. "Maya works in marketing," she said quickly. "She's got her own thing going on." It wasn't technically a lie, but it certainly wasn't the whole truth either. The conversation moved on to post-graduation plans and career opportunities. I listened as Jessica outlined her ambitious goals for expanding her consulting business, the same business I'd helped her start from my tiny apartment using my laptop and my industry connections. She spoke about her 5-year plan with the confidence of someone who'd built everything herself, never once mentioning the financial foundation that had made it all possible. I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment to process what I'd just witnessed. In the bathroom mirror, I stared at my reflection and tried to understand how I'd become so invisible in my own family's narrative. The navy dress that had seemed so perfect that morning now felt cheap and out of place among all the designer outfits and professional photography sessions happening in the lobby. When I returned, the group had moved outside for more photos. I watched from a distance as my parents posed proudly with Jessica, their successful daughter who'd achieved everything through her own hard work and determination. At one point, my father called me over to join a family photo, but Jessica was already in deep conversation with what appeared to be a potential client, so the moment passed without the shot being taken. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself increasingly pushed to the margins of the celebration. Conversations flowed around me without including me. Photos were taken without waiting for me to get in frame, and dinner plans were discussed as if I wasn't standing right there. When someone finally did address me directly, it was to ask if I needed directions back to the freeway for my drive home to Portland. The final straw came during the dinner reservation discussion. Jessica was coordinating with our parents about where to celebrate, and when the restaurant hostess asked about the party size, she said 4 people without hesitation. When I pointed out that would actually be 5, including me, Jessica looked genuinely surprised, as if she'd forgotten I was planning to stay for dinner. "Oh, right," she said, checking her phone. "Actually, I'm not sure they can accommodate 5 on such short notice. Maybe you should head back before traffic gets bad." I made my excuses and left before the tears could start. The 3-hour drive back to Portland passed in a blur of highway lights and radio static. I kept replaying the day's events, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when I'd realized that my own family saw me as an outsider at what should have been our shared celebration. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted from trying to make sense of it all. That night, I sat on my small couch with a glass of wine and my laptop, scrolling through the photos Jessica had already posted on social media. There she was with our parents, beaming in her cap and gown. There was a shot of her with her classmates, all of them looking polished and successful. There were pictures of the diploma, the flowers, the celebration dinner I hadn't been invited to join. But in every single photo, I was absent. Not cropped out, not hidden behind someone else, just completely absent, as if I hadn't been there at all. The captions told the story Jessica wanted to share with the world. Grateful for my parents' support and proud to have earned this degree through hard work and determination. On to the next chapter. The comments poured in from friends and acquaintances, all praising her independence and work ethic. Person after person congratulated her on doing it all herself and being such an inspiration for self-made success. I closed the laptop and poured another glass of wine, trying to process the growing realization that this wasn't just about graduation day. This was about a pattern I'd been too close to see clearly. For 4 years, I'd been telling myself that I was investing in our family's future, that Jessica's success would somehow benefit all of us. But what I'd actually been doing was funding someone else's dream while my own dreams collected dust. The next morning brought a hangover and a text message from my mother. "Thank you for coming yesterday. Jessica was so happy you could make it." No mention of the seating arrangement, no acknowledgement of how I'd been treated, just polite gratitude. For my attendance as if I'd been a distant relative doing them a favor by showing up. I spent the weekend going through old emails and text messages, looking for clues I might have missed. What I found was a gradual shift in tone over the years. In the beginning, Jessica's requests for financial help had been humble and grateful, full of promises about paying me back and making it up to me someday. But as time went on, the requests became expectations, and the gratitude disappeared entirely. By her final year, she was simply informing me about tuition deadlines and textbook costs, assuming I would handle them without question. I found bank statements showing exactly how much I'd contributed to her education over 4 years, nearly $60,000. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Money I'd earned working 60-hour weeks, living in a studio apartment with no air conditioning, driving a car that broke down monthly, and buying groceries from the discount bin at the corner store. Money that could have finished my own degree, started my own business, or at least allowed me to live with some dignity and financial security. But perhaps more painful than the financial cost was the emotional one. For 4 years, I'd postponed my own dreams, telling myself it was temporary, that once Jessica graduated and got established in her career, I could focus on my own goals. I'd turned down job opportunities that would have required me to move or travel, worried that Jessica might need my help with an emergency. I'd declined invitations to social events because I was always working extra shifts to cover her latest expense. Now, sitting in my tiny apartment on a Sunday morning, I realized that Jessica had never actually asked me to make these sacrifices. I'd volunteered them, driven by some combination of love, duty, and the belief that families support each other unconditionally. But somewhere along the way, my voluntary support had become her assumed entitlement, and my sacrifices had become invisible to everyone, including apparently myself. The phone rang, interrupting my brooding. It was my college roommate, Emma, calling from Seattle, where she'd moved after graduating with the degree I'd abandoned to support Jessica. "Hey, stranger," she said cheerfully. "I saw Jessica's graduation. Photos on Facebook. How was the ceremony?" I found myself telling Emma the whole story, from the back row seating to the dinner exclusion to Jessica's revisionist history about funding her own education. Emma listened without interrupting, making small sympathetic sounds at the appropriate moments. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Maya," she said carefully, "I have to ask you something, and I hope you won't get mad. But have you ever considered that Jessica might not actually see what you've done for her as a sacrifice? Like, maybe in her mind, you were just helping out family, and now that she's graduated, that chapter is closed?" The question hit me like a splash of cold water. It hadn't occurred to me that Jessica might genuinely not understand the magnitude of what I'd given up for her education. In her world, perhaps older sisters simply supported younger sisters through college, the same way parents supported their children. Maybe she'd never realized that I'd had my own dreams and ambitions that I'd set aside for hers. But even if that were true, it didn't explain the graduation day treatment or the false narrative about her self-funded success. Those felt more intentional, more like choices than misunderstandings. And the growing distance I'd felt from her over the past year suggested she was aware on some level that our relationship had become unbalanced. After I hung up with Emma, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the folder on my computer, labeled my stuff, where I'd stored all the dreams and plans I'd put on hold. There were applications to graduate programs I'd never submitted, business plans I'd never implemented, and a half-finished novel I'd been writing before Jessica's. Education became my full-time second job. Looking at those abandoned projects felt like visiting a museum of my former self. The woman who'd written those business plans had been ambitious and optimistic, full of ideas about what she could accomplish if she just worked hard enough. The woman staring at the screen now felt tired and resentful, like she'd woken up from a 4-year coma to discover that life had moved on without her. I spent the rest of the day updating my resume and browsing job listings, something I hadn't done since taking my current position specifically because it offered the flexible schedule. I needed to support Jessica. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider opportunities that would require travel or relocation, positions that would challenge me professionally instead of just paying the bills. That evening, I drafted an email to Jessica. Wrote and rewrote it a dozen times, trying to find the right tone between hurt and accusatory, between honest and melodramatic. In the end, I settled on something simple and direct. "Hi, Jess. I've been thinking about graduation day and our conversation about how you funded your MBA. I wanted to clarify some things about the financial support I provided over the past 4 years. Can we talk sometime this week?" I stared at the draft for another hour before deleting it entirely. What was I hoping to accomplish with that conversation? An apology, acknowledgement, retroactive gratitude? None of those things would change what had already happened or restore the years I'd spent investing in someone else's future instead of my own. Instead, I opened a new document and began writing down everything I could remember about the money I'd sent Jessica over the years. Not because I expected to be repaid, but because I needed to see the full scope of what I'd done in black and white. The list grew longer than I'd expected. Tuition payments, textbook money, living expenses during her unpaid internships, conference, fees, laptop replacement, interview suit, graduation dress, and dozens of smaller expenses that had seemed insignificant at the time, but added up to thousands of dollars. More importantly, I started listing the opportunities I'd turned down or delayed because of my financial commitment to Jessica's education. The promotion that would have required relocating to San Francisco. The graduate program scholarship I'd declined because I couldn't afford to stop working full-time. The business partnership offer from a former colleague who'd since built a successful consulting firm of her own. By midnight, I had filled 6 pages with the hidden costs of my generosity. Some were financial, others were professional, but the most painful were the personal ones. The relationships I'd let fade because I was always working. The hobbies I'd abandoned because they required time and money I didn't have. The simple pleasures I'd foregone, like vacations or nice dinners, or clothes that weren't from discount stores. As I finally turned off my laptop and got ready for bed, I realized that graduation day hadn't been the beginning of my invisibility in Jessica's life. It had been the culmination of a slow fade that had been happening for years. I'd been so focused on supporting her dreams that I'd forgotten to tend to my own, and somewhere along the way, everyone, including Jessica, had stopped seeing me as a person with my own ambitions and started seeing me as simply a source of support for hers. The question now was what to do with this painful new clarity. I could confront Jessica directly and demand acknowledgement for my sacrifices, but that felt like begging for gratitude that should have been freely given. I could simply distance myself gradually and hope she eventually noticed, but that seemed passive and unlikely to change anything meaningful. Or I could do something I hadn't done in 4 years. I could start putting my own dreams first and see what happened when I stopped being available to fund and support everyone else's ambitions. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you'd forgotten you knew how to fly. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I found myself imagining a different version of graduation day, one where I sat in the front row wearing a cap and gown of my own, where the congratulations and celebration were for achievements I'd earned through my own hard work and determination. It was a beautiful dream, and for the first time in years, it felt like something that might actually be possible if I had the courage to reach for it. The Chen family had always operated on unspoken hierarchies, and I'd learned early that questioning them was futile. Our house in Beaverton sat on a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees and identical mailboxes, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew which family drove which car and whose teenager had gotten into which college. My parents had worked 16-hour days at their restaurant Golden Dragon for 23 years to afford that house, and every conversation somehow circled back to the sacrifices they'd made for their daughters' futures. Jessica had been the golden child from birth, arriving 2 years before me with an easy smile and an intuitive understanding of how to make adults proud. She walked early, talked early, and by kindergarten was already reading chapter books while I was still struggling with picture books. Teachers loved her, neighbors praised her, and my parents beamed whenever anyone mentioned her name. I became accustomed to being introduced as Jessica's little sister rather than by my own name. By high school, the pattern was firmly established. Jessica excelled at everything she touched: student council president, valedictorian, full scholarship to University of Oregon for her undergraduate degree. I was a solid B student who played JV soccer and worked part-time at the local movie theater to save money for college. Our parents attended every one of Jessica's debate tournaments and academic award ceremonies, while my soccer games often conflicted with restaurant hours and went unattended. I told myself it didn't matter. Jessica deserved the attention because she worked harder, achieved more, had bigger dreams. I was content to be the practical sister, the one who helped with younger cousins at family gatherings while Jessica networked with adults about internships and career opportunities. When guidance counselors asked about my post-graduation plans, I gave vague answers about maybe studying business or communications. Nothing as concrete as Jessica's detailed timeline for law school followed by an MBA. The financial reality of our family became clear during my senior year when my parents sat me down for what they called the college conversation. They could afford to help with tuition for one daughter's education, they explained gently. Jessica's academic record made her the obvious choice for their investment. They would co-sign loans for me, of course, and help however they could, but the bulk of their savings had already been allocated to Jessica's educational fund. I nodded and smiled and told them I understood completely. And I did understand, at least intellectually. Jessica had earned their support through years of academic excellence. It made practical sense to invest in the child most likely to achieve significant success. What I didn't understand was how casually they'd made this decision, how little discussion had gone into effectively choosing one daughter's future over the others. The summer before college, I worked double shifts at the movie theater and picked up catering gigs through my parents' restaurant contacts. Jessica spent her time at pre-college programs and networking events, building relationships that would serve her throughout her undergraduate years. We'd both been accepted to University of Oregon, but our experiences there would be vastly different. She'd have the luxury of focusing entirely on her studies, while I'd need to work 30 hours a week just to cover basic expenses. During my freshman year at Portland State, I watched Jessica's social media posts from Eugene with a mixture of pride and envy. She joined the honors program, landed a prestigious internship, and seemed to make friends effortlessly. Her posts showed a college experience that looked like a movie. Study groups in beautiful libraries, weekend trips to the coast with her sorority sisters, internships at law firms downtown. Meanwhile, I was living in the cheapest dormitory available, eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights, and falling asleep over textbooks after finishing my shifts at the campus coffee shop. The first time Jessica asked for money, I was surprised by how natural it felt to say yes. She needed $300 for a conference that would look great on law school applications but wasn't covered by her scholarship. I had exactly $312 in my checking account, money I'd been saving for textbooks the following semester. I sent her the money without hesitation, telling myself I'd figure out the textbook situation later. The requests became more frequent during her sophomore year. A laptop for law school prep classes, interview clothes for summer internship applications, money for the LSAT prep course that cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. Each time, Jessica presented the expense as an investment in our family's future. Once I get into a good law school and then a top MBA program, I'll be able to help everyone, she'd say. This is just temporary until I can start giving back. I began picking up extra shifts and side jobs to meet her requests, tutoring high school students in math and English, dog walking for busy professionals in the Pearl District, freelance social media management for small businesses. I became an expert at stretching dollars and finding creative ways to make ends meet. My own grades started slipping as my work schedule expanded, but Jessica's continued to soar. By my junior year, I'd fallen behind academically and financially. The cost of supporting Jessica's various educational expenses while paying my own tuition had become unsustainable on a part-time income. My academic advisor suggested I consider taking a gap year to get my finances in order and return to school, when I could focus properly on my studies. The idea terrified me at first, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Jessica was applying to MBA programs by then, and the application costs alone were staggering. Between application fees, test prep, interview travel expenses, and deposit requirements, she needed nearly $5,000 in a 6-month period. My parents helped where they could, but the restaurant business had been struggling since a new shopping center opened nearby with cheaper dining options. Jessica turned to me with the desperation of someone who'd worked too hard to let financial constraints derail her dreams. The decision to leave school felt less like a choice and more like an inevitable conclusion to a story that had been written years earlier. I framed it as a temporary sacrifice, a way to help Jessica achieve the success that would eventually benefit our entire family. My parents were grateful but worried, asking repeatedly if I was sure about postponing my own education. Jessica was relieved and promised it would only be for 2 years at most, just until she finished her MBA and landed a well-paying job. I moved back home to save on rent and took on 3 part-time jobs: mornings at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, afternoons at a marketing agency doing administrative work, and evenings helping my parents at the restaurant during busy periods. The marketing agency job turned out to be a blessing in disguise, exposing me to skills and connections I never would have gained in a classroom. My supervisor, a woman named Patricia, who'd built her own consulting business before joining the agency, took me under her wing and taught me about client relations, project management, and strategic planning. Within 6 months, I was handling accounts independently and had proven myself valuable enough to negotiate a small raise and more flexible hours. Patricia encouraged me to think about starting my own consulting practice eventually, pointing out that I had natural instincts for understanding what clients needed and translating complex ideas into actionable strategies. For the first time since leaving school, I felt like I was building towards something meaningful, rather than just treading water. Jessica's MBA program acceptance letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday in March. She'd been accepted to 3 schools, but chose the University of Oregon's business program, partly for the reduced tuition as a state resident, and partly because she'd maintained connections there from her undergraduate years. The total cost would be just over $80,000 for 2 years, including living expenses, books, and the various fees that seemed to multiply with each semester. My parents could contribute about $15,000 from their savings money they'd managed to set aside despite the restaurant's declining profits. Jessica had qualified for some financial aid, but it barely made a dent in the overall cost. The remaining $50,000 would need to come from somewhere, and we all knew that somewhere was me. I spent a week running numbers, calculating how much I could realistically save while covering my own basic expenses. The math was daunting, but not impossible if I was willing to live extremely frugally and work almost constantly for the next 2 years. I'd need to move to an even cheaper apartment, give up any discretionary spending, and probably take on additional freelance work on weekends and evenings. Patricia noticed my distraction at work and asked if everything was okay. When I explained the situation, she was quiet for a long moment before offering a suggestion that would change everything. Her consulting business was growing faster than she could handle alone, and she'd been thinking about bringing on a partner rather than just hiring additional employees. If I was interested, she could structure a partnership that would provide steady income while giving me experience running my own client accounts. The opportunity was exactly what I'd been hoping for without realizing it. Patricia's business focused on helping small and medium-sized companies improve their marketing strategies and operational efficiency, work that felt meaningful and challenging. More importantly, the potential income from the partnership would be enough to support both Jessica's education and my own modest living expenses, without requiring me to work 3 separate jobs. I threw myself into the consulting work with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt since high school. Patricia was an excellent mentor, patient with my mistakes but demanding when it came to quality and professionalism. I learned to conduct client interviews, analyze business processes, create strategic recommendations, and present findings to skeptical executives who initially saw me as too young and inexperienced to offer valuable insights. The work was harder than anything I'd done in college, but it was also more rewarding. Instead of memorizing information for tests I'd forget immediately afterward, I was solving real problems for real businesses and seeing the tangible results of my efforts. Clients began requesting me specifically for certain types of projects, and within a year, I was managing my own portfolio of accounts while still learning from Patricia's expertise. Jessica started her MBA program that fall with everything she needed: a reliable laptop, professional wardrobe, textbooks, and enough savings to cover her living expenses for the first semester. She seemed genuinely grateful for my support and called regularly to update me on her classes, professors, and networking opportunities. For the first time in our relationship, I felt like we were truly partners in building our family's future rather than competitors for limited resources. The consulting business continued to grow, and Patricia began talking about expanding into new service areas where my skills would be particularly valuable. She suggested I consider getting some formal business education eventually, either through a degree program or professional certification courses. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was becoming more professionally accomplished outside of college than I'd ever been as a student, but I filed away her suggestions for future consideration. Jessica's first year of business school flew by in a blur of case studies, group projects, and internship applications. She landed a competitive summer position at a consulting firm in Seattle, work that would provide valuable experience and excellent networking opportunities. The internship was unpaid, but the potential career benefits were significant enough that she needed financial support to cover her living expenses for 3 months. I agreed to help without hesitation, viewing it as an extension of the educational investment we'd already made. The Seattle internship went well, leading to a job offer for after graduation and connections that would prove valuable throughout Jessica's career. She returned to Eugene for her second year with increased confidence and a clearer vision of her professional goals. My own professional development continued as well. Patricia and I had formalized our partnership arrangement, and I was earning more money than I'd ever imagined possible without a college degree. More importantly, I was building a reputation in Portland's business community as someone who could solve complex problems and deliver results. Several clients had mentioned me to their colleagues, leading to referrals and opportunities that kept our calendar fully booked. The consulting work also gave me insights into how successful businesses operated, knowledge that would prove invaluable when I eventually started thinking about my own entrepreneurial ventures. I learned about financial planning, strategic growth, market analysis, and team management through hands-on experience rather than theoretical study. Patricia often joked that I was getting a better business education than most MBA students, just through a different pathway. As Jessica's graduation approached, I felt proud of what we'd accomplished together. She'd excelled academically, built valuable professional relationships, and secured a job that would provide both financial stability and career advancement opportunities. My own career had flourished in ways I couldn't have predicted when I left college 3 years earlier. The sacrifice had been difficult, but it seemed to have worked exactly as we'd hoped. I began thinking about my own next steps, conversations. I'd been postponing while focused on supporting Jessica's education. Patricia had suggested several times that I consider pursuing some form of advanced education, either a degree program or professional certifications that would enhance my consulting credentials. With Jessica's graduation approaching and my financial obligations decreasing, I started researching options that would fit with my work schedule and career goals. The future felt full of possibilities for the first time in years. Jessica would be established in her career and financially independent. I'd have the freedom to invest in my own professional development without worrying about supporting someone else's dreams. Our family would finally have 2 successful daughters, instead of 1 successful daughter, and one who'd sacrificed her own ambitions for her sister's benefit. The first crack in my carefully constructed narrative appeared during Jessica's winter break of her second year. She'd come home to Beaverton for 2 weeks, and I'd been looking forward to spending time together without the constant pressure of school deadlines and financial requests. I'd planned a sister's day in Portland, complete with brunch at our favorite spot in the Pearl District and shopping for her upcoming graduation outfit. We were walking through Pioneer Place Mall when Jessica casually mentioned that several of her classmates had been impressed by her entrepreneurial spirit. "They think it's amazing that I started my own consulting business while in school," she said, pausing to look at a dress in a shop window. "Most of them are still just focused on grades and internships." I stopped walking. "Your consulting? Business?" I asked carefully. "You mean the one Patricia and I run?" Jessica laughed and waved her hand dismissively. "Well, obviously you do the actual work, but it was my idea to start it, remember? And I'm the one with the business school background to make it legitimate." She turned back to the dress, apparently not noticing the look on my face. "Plus, having my name associated with it will be great for credibility once I graduate and start bringing in my own clients." The conversation continued, but I barely heard the rest of it. Jessica spoke as if the consulting business that had become my career and passion was simply a side project she'd graciously allowed me to manage on her behalf. She mentioned telling her study group about her innovative approach to client relations and how she planned to expand her business model after graduation. When I tried to clarify my role in building the business, Jessica nodded impatiently and said, "Of course you've been essential, Maya. I couldn't have done it without your help." The word help stung more than I expected. In her mind, I'd been helping her with her business rather than building something of my own. That evening, I called Patricia to vent about the conversation. Patricia listened quietly before asking a question that made my stomach drop. "Maya, when you and Jessica talk about the business, does she understand that you're my partner, not..." Just an employee managing her accounts? I realized I'd never explicitly explained the partnership structure to Jessica. When I'd told her about the opportunity Patricia offered, I'd focused on how it would provide stable income to support her education, rather than emphasizing my own professional growth and ownership stake. Jessica had apparently interpreted my work as a favor I was doing for her benefit, rather than a career I was building for myself. The misunderstanding might have been correctable with a simple conversation, but over the following weeks, I noticed other troubling patterns. Jessica had added founder Chen Consulting Services to her LinkedIn profile, even though no such company existed. When I mentioned this, she explained that she was building her brand for post-graduation job searches and networking events. During family dinners, Jessica would casually reference her business success when relatives asked about her plans after graduation. She spoke knowledgeably about client management and strategic planning, knowledge she'd gained through our conversations, rather than hands-on experience. My parents beamed with pride at their daughter's entrepreneurial accomplishments, while I sat quietly and wondered when I'd become a supporting character in Jessica's success story. The situation came to a head during a family gathering at my Aunt Sarah's house in March. Jessica was holding court in the living room, entertaining cousins and family friends with stories about balancing business school with running her own company. She spoke eloquently about the challenges of client acquisition and the importance of maintaining professional relationships, topics we'd discussed extensively but that she'd never actually handled independently. Uncle Mark, who owned a small manufacturing business, was particularly impressed. "It's unusual to see someone your age with such practical business experience," he told Jessica. "Most MBA students are all theory and no real-world application." Jessica accepted the compliment gracefully, adding that she believed in learning by doing rather than just studying case studies. I excused myself to help Aunt Sarah in the kitchen, where I could hear the conversation continuing through the doorway. Jessica was explaining her philosophy of client relations, using examples from accounts I'd managed personally and strategies I'd developed through months of trial and error. She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd lived through those experiences, never mentioning that her knowledge came secondhand. Aunt Sarah noticed my distraction and asked if everything was okay. I found myself explaining the situation more honestly than I'd intended, describing how Jessica seemed to have rewritten history to make herself the entrepreneur and me the assistant. Aunt Sarah listened with growing concern, occasionally glancing toward the living room where Jessica continued her performance. "Have you talked to her about this directly?" Aunt Sarah asked. When I admitted I hadn't, she suggested it might be a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved with honest communication. But her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of Jessica's innocence in the matter. The ride home from Aunt Sarah's was tense. Jessica chatted excitedly about the positive response to her business stories, apparently oblivious to my growing frustration. When I finally brought up the consulting business discussion, she seemed genuinely surprised by my concerns. "Maya, you're being too sensitive," she said. "Obviously, everyone knows you're involved in the business. I just don't think it's necessary to go into all the boring details about partnership structures and daily operations." She paused, then added, "Besides, having an MBA gives me credibility that you don't have. It's better for everyone if I'm the face of the business when we're talking to potential clients or professional contacts." The word "we" should have been reassuring, but somehow it made everything worse. Jessica wasn't trying to steal credit for my work. She genuinely believed that her theoretical education made her more qualified to represent our joint efforts than my practical experience. In her mind, she was protecting both of us by presenting herself as the primary business owner. I spent the next several days thinking about the conversation and trying to understand when our partnership had become so unbalanced in Jessica's perception. Patricia had noticed my distraction and asked directly if something was wrong. When I explained the situation, her reaction was swift and clear. "Maya, You need to understand something important, Patricia said firmly. The work you do here isn't just a job or a favor to your sister. You're a legitimate business professional with real skills and accomplishments. Don't let anyone, including Jessica, minimize what you've built. Patricia's words were exactly what I needed to hear, but they also highlighted how much I'd internalized Jessica's narrative about my role in the family. I'd become so accustomed to supporting her dreams that I'd stopped recognizing my own achievements as valuable in their own right. The consulting business had grown significantly under my management, with client retention rates above 90% and referral business accounting for more than half of our new accounts. I developed innovative approaches to client relations that Patricia planned to incorporate into her training materials for future employees. Several clients had specifically requested my involvement in their projects, recognizing expertise that had nothing to do with Jessica's academic credentials. Yet somehow, I'd allowed Jessica to position herself as the visionary behind these accomplishments, while I remained the skilled worker who implemented her ideas. The dynamic was so familiar from our childhood that I'd barely noticed it happening, again in our professional relationship. I decided to address the issue directly with Jessica, choosing a moment when we were both relaxed and unlikely to become defensive. We were having coffee at our favorite spot near the University of Oregon campus during one of my visits to Eugene. Jessica was in a good mood, excited about upcoming graduation plans and job opportunities. I wanted to talk about the consulting business, I began carefully. I think there's been some confusion about how Patricia and I structured the partnership. Jessica nodded encouragingly, apparently expecting a routine business update. When I explained that I was Patricia's equal partner rather than an employee managing accounts on Jessica's behalf, her expression shifted from interest to confusion to something that looked almost like betrayal. But I thought we were building this together, she said. You never told me you were starting your own separate business. She paused, processing the information. What about after I graduate? I assumed we'd formalize our partnership and expand the business together. The conversation revealed the depth of our mutual misunderstanding. Jessica had genuinely believed that my consulting work was a temporary arrangement designed to support her education while building a business we'd eventually run together. I had viewed it as my own career development, separate from my financial support for her MBA program. Neither of us had been deliberately deceptive, but we'd both made assumptions that served our own interests and expectations. Jessica had assumed I was building something for both of us because she couldn't imagine me pursuing independent success while she was still in school. I had assumed she understood the distinction between my career and my financial support, because the difference seemed obvious to me. The conversation ended without resolution, both of us realizing that our assumptions about the future were incompatible, but neither ready to address the deeper implications. Jessica returned to school, and I continued managing my consulting accounts, but the easy comfort of our relationship had shifted into something more complicated and fragile. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in Jessica's behavior during our phone calls. She asked fewer questions about my work and seemed less interested in business updates that had previously fascinated her. When she did mention the consulting business to others, she was more careful about her language, but she still positioned herself as the family entrepreneur, rather than acknowledging my independent professional development. The disconnect between Jessica's public narrative and our private reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. At family gatherings, she continued to speak about her business experience and entrepreneurial insights, knowledge that came entirely from our conversations about my actual work with clients. She'd incorporated my strategies and approaches into her academic presentations, earning praise from professors and classmates for innovative thinking that she'd never tested in real business situations. Meanwhile, I found myself downplaying my professional accomplishments in family settings, partly from habit and partly to avoid undermining Jessica's carefully constructed image. When relatives asked about my work, I described it as helping small businesses with their operations. Rather than explaining that I was a partner in a successful consulting firm, with a growing reputation in Portland's business community. The situation reached a breaking point during Jessica's final semester when she began actively networking for post-graduation opportunities. She'd listed her consulting experience prominently on her resume and was using client success stories from my accounts as examples of her business acumen during job interviews. When I learned about this through a mutual acquaintance who'd been contacted as a reference, I felt a level of anger I'd never experienced toward Jessica. She wasn't just misrepresenting our arrangement to family and friends anymore. She was potentially damaging my professional reputation by claiming credit for work I'd done with actual clients who could verify the truth. I called Jessica immediately, demanding an explanation. Her response was defensive and revealing. "Maya, you're overreacting. These are just interview stories. And technically, you wouldn't have those clients if I hadn't suggested starting the business in the first place. Besides, you don't even have a college degree. These companies aren't going to hire you anyway, so why does it matter if I use the experience to help my career?" The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. Jessica genuinely believed that my lack of formal education disqualified me from professional recognition, making it acceptable for her to appropriate my accomplishments for her own advancement. In her mind, she was simply making better use of resources that would otherwise be wasted on someone without proper credentials. I hung up without responding, too angry and hurt to trust myself to continue the conversation. For the first time, since dropping out of college to support Jessica's education, I questioned whether I'd made a terrible mistake that had cost me far more than money or time. The graduation invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, slipped between utility, bills, and grocery store advertisements in my small mailbox. The envelope was thick and formal, embossed with the University of Oregon seal, and addressed to the Chen family. I carried it upstairs to my apartment, expecting the familiar warmth of anticipation I'd felt for Jessica's previous academic milestones. Instead, when I opened the invitation, I found something that made my stomach lurch. The main invitation was addressed to my parents, with 2 guest tickets enclosed. Not 3, 2. At the bottom, in Jessica's familiar handwriting, was a note. "Maya, I know you'll understand about the limited seating. Maybe we can celebrate afterward." I sat on my small couch, staring at the invitation and trying to process what I was seeing. Jessica had allocated her guest tickets to our parents, leaving me without a seat at her MBA graduation. The ceremony I'd been anticipating for 2 years, the moment that would mark the end of my financial sacrifices and the beginning of Jessica's professional success, would happen without me in attendance. My first instinct was to call Jessica and ask if there had been a mistake. Surely she'd forgotten to request an additional ticket, or perhaps the university had miscounted her allocation. But as I reached for my phone, I remembered conversations from previous weeks where Jessica had mentioned the exclusive nature of MBA graduation ceremonies and how competitive the ticket allocation process had become. She talked about classmates struggling to accommodate extended families and the difficult decisions required when too many people wanted to attend. She'd never once asked how many tickets I would need or whether I was planning to attend. The exclusion wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate choice. I spent the rest of the day alternating between hurt and anger, trying to understand how Jessica could justify leaving me out of this culminating moment. I'd worked 3 jobs for 2 years to make her education possible. I'd deferred my own dreams, lived in cramped apartments, and forgone basic luxuries to ensure she had everything she needed for success. And somehow, she'd concluded that my presence at her graduation wasn't important enough to warrant one of her precious guest tickets. That evening, I called my parents to ask if they'd received their invitation. My mother answered with excitement in her voice, already planning what to wear and discussing logistics for the drive to Eugene. When I mentioned that I hadn't received a ticket, there was a long pause before she responded. "Oh, honey. Jessica mentioned something about limited seating," my mother said carefully. "She said she could only invite immediate family, and since you're so busy with work, she thought you might prefer to skip the ceremony and just join us for dinner afterward." The explanation was so obviously crafted to avoid hurt feelings that it made everything worse. Jessica had anticipated my reaction and prepared a narrative that made my exclusion seem like a thoughtful accommodation rather than a dismissal. She'd even enlisted our mother in delivering the message, ensuring that any objection I raised would seem ungrateful and selfish. I asked my mother directly if she thought it was fair that I wouldn't be attending Jessica's graduation after everything I'd contributed to her education. The question hung in the air for several uncomfortable seconds before she responded with the careful neutrality she'd perfected over years of managing conflicts between her daughters. "Maya, you know how proud we are of everything you've done for Jessica. But graduation is really about celebrating her achievement, and she gets to decide how she wants to handle the guest list." She paused, then added gently, "Maybe it would be better to focus on being happy for her success rather than worrying about the details of the ceremony." I ended the call feeling more isolated than ever. Even my mother, who'd witnessed my sacrifices firsthand, was prioritizing Jessica's preferences over my feelings. The message was clear. My role was to support Jessica's success quietly and gracefully, without expecting recognition or inclusion in the moments that mattered most. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over the graduation invitation and what it represented. This wasn't just about missing a ceremony. It was about being systematically erased from the narrative of Jessica's achievement. The people who mattered most to our family would gather to celebrate her success without any acknowledgement of the sacrifices that had made it possible. I imagined the conversations that would happen at the graduation reception, the proud parents sharing stories about their daughter's accomplishments, the impressed classmates hearing about Jessica's entrepreneurial experience and business acumen. None of those stories would include me, even though my contributions had been essential to making them possible. The exclusion felt like a preview of how the rest of my life would unfold in relation to Jessica's success. She would continue to build her career using knowledge and connections developed through my support, while I remained invisible in the background, grateful for whatever scraps of acknowledgement she chose to offer. I decided to call Jessica directly and address the situation honestly. When she answered, her voice was cheerful and distracted, apparently multitasking while we talked. I could hear papers rustling and what sounded like typing in the background. "Hey Maya, what's up? I'm just finishing a project for my strategic management class." "I wanted to talk about graduation," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I noticed I didn't receive a ticket." Jessica's typing stopped. "Oh, right. Yeah, the ticket situation is really complicated this year. They're being super strict about the guest limits, and I could only get 2 tickets total." She paused, then continued with manufactured enthusiasm. "But we can definitely celebrate afterward. I was thinking we could do a nice dinner, just the family." "Jessica, I've been supporting your education for 2 years. I dropped out of college so you could finish your MBA without debt. Don't you think I should be there for your graduation?" The silence that followed was long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. When Jessica finally responded, her tone had shifted from cheerful to defensive. "Maya, I appreciate everything you've done, I really do. But graduation is about my academic achievement, not about who helped pay for it." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "Besides, you've never been that interested in academic stuff anyway. I thought you'd be happier skipping the boring ceremony and just joining us for the fun part." The casual dismissal in her voice was devastating. Jessica had reduced 2 years of financial sacrifice to helping pay for it, and characterized my desire to attend as inappropriate focus on something that wasn't about me. She'd reframed my exclusion as a favor, protecting me from a boring ceremony I wouldn't enjoy anyway. "This isn't about me wanting credit," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "It's about being included in a moment that I helped make possible. I've been working 60-hour weeks so you could focus on your studies. I've been living like a college student so you could graduate debt-free. The least you could do is save me a seat." Jessica's response was swift and cutting. "Maya, you chose to drop out of college. You chose to work those jobs. I never asked you to sacrifice your own education for mine." Her voice carried an edge I'd rarely heard before. "I'm grateful for your help, but that doesn't mean you get to dictate how I handle my graduation." The word help again, minimizing years of sacrifice to casual assistance. Jessica had convinced herself that my contributions were voluntary gifts rather than systematic support that had made her success possible. In her mind, my sacrifices were my choice, and my desire for recognition was inappropriate and selfish. I tried one more approach, appealing to our relationship rather than my contributions. "Jessica, we're sisters. I want to be there to celebrate with you. Can't you request an additional ticket or see if someone else can give up theirs?" "Maya, you're being really emotional about this." Jessica's tone had become patronizing, the voice she used when she thought I was overreacting to something obvious. "It's just a ceremony. The important thing is that we're all proud of what I've accomplished. You don't need to be physically present for that." The conversation ended shortly after, with Jessica promising to make dinner reservations for after the ceremony and suggesting I use the free time to focus on my own work, rather than worrying about hers. I hung up feeling completely dismissed and wondering how we'd reached a point where my sister could exclude me from the most important day of her academic career without apparent guilt or concern. That night, I lay awake thinking about the progression of our relationship over the past 2 years. Jessica's requests for financial support had evolved from humble asks to assumed entitlements. Her gratitude had transformed into casual acknowledgement, and finally into the expectation that my sacrifices were simply part of my role as her sister. Somewhere along the way, Jessica had stopped seeing me as a person with my own feelings and aspirations and started viewing me as a resource to be managed efficiently. My exclusion from graduation wasn't personal, it was practical. She had limited tickets and more important people to invite. The realization was crushing, but it was also clarifying. I'd been operating under the assumption that Jessica and I were partners in building her success, that my sacrifices were investments in our shared future. But Jessica saw the arrangement differently. She was the star, and I was part of the supporting crew, valuable but ultimately replaceable, and certainly not entitled to share the spotlight. I spent the following week in a strange state of emotional numbness, going through the motions of work and daily life while processing the implications of Jessica's choice. Patricia noticed my distraction and asked if everything was okay, but I wasn't ready to discuss the situation with anyone else. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for Saturday, May 15th at 2 p.m. On that morning, I woke up in my small apartment, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table while my parents drove to Eugene to watch Jessica receive her MBA. I imagined them taking pictures, meeting her classmates, sharing in the pride and excitement of the moment I'd been excluded from experiencing. Instead of wallowing, I decided to do something I'd been postponing for months. I opened my laptop and began researching graduate programs and professional certification courses that would advance my own career. If Jessica could succeed through education and credentials, so could I. If my practical experience wasn't valued by my own family, I'd find ways to make it impossible to dismiss. As I scrolled through program descriptions and application requirements, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my own future rather than vicarious pride in someone else's achievements. Jessica's exclusion had been painful, but it had also freed me from the obligation to prioritize her dreams over my own. By the time my parents returned from Eugene that evening, I'd submitted applications to 3 programs and scheduled informational interviews with 2 others. I'd also begun drafting a business plan for expanding my consulting work beyond the partnership with Patricia, exploring opportunities that would establish my own independent professional identity. When my mother called to share details about the graduation ceremony, I listened politely, but without the engagement she expected. She described Jessica's academic honors, the inspiring commencement speech, and the reception where Jessica had networked with potential employers and business contacts. "She looked so beautiful and confident," my mother said. "You would have been so proud to see her up there receiving her diploma." I agreed that I would have been proud if I'd been allowed to attend. But I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I congratulated Jessica on her achievement and asked about dinner plans for the following week, when we could celebrate as a family. The conversation was pleasant and normal on the surface, but underneath, everything had changed. The silence in my apartment after hanging up from Jessica felt different from any quiet I'd experienced before. It wasn't the comfortable solitude I'd grown accustomed to during my years of working multiple jobs and living alone. This silence felt heavy, pressing against my chest like a physical weight that made breathing difficult. I sat on my small couch, still holding my phone, and tried to process what had just happened. Jessica's words echoed in my mind with startling clarity. "You chose to drop out of college. You chose to work those jobs. I never asked you to sacrifice your own education for mine." The casual way she'd delivered those sentences, as if they were simple statements of fact rather than accusations that rewrote our entire family history, left me feeling disoriented and questioning my own memories. Had I really chosen to leave Portland State? Or had I been maneuvered into a situation where leaving felt like the only viable option? The distinction seemed crucial now, but at the time, the decision had felt both voluntary and inevitable. Jessica had needed financial support that our parents couldn't provide. I'd been struggling academically while working part-time to pay my own expenses. Taking a gap year to help her while getting my own finances in order had seemed like a practical solution that would benefit everyone. But somewhere in the intervening 2 years, that temporary sacrifice had transformed into something permanent in Jessica's mind. She spoke about my contributions as if they were gifts I'd volunteered rather than systematic support she'd actively requested. The monthly phone calls asking for tuition money, textbook funds, and living expenses had apparently been reframed in her memory as suggestions I'd chosen to act upon rather than direct requests for help. I walked to my kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands trembling slightly as I held the cup. Through my small window, I could see the Portland skyline in the distance, the city where I'd built a career and established an independent life while simultaneously funding someone else's dreams. The view had always felt hopeful to me, representing possibilities and potential that stretched beyond my current circumstances. Tonight, it looked foreign and unreachable. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. I assumed it would be Jessica calling back to apologize or at least acknowledge the harshness of her previous comments. Instead, it was my mother, her voice carefully neutral in the way that meant she was trying to manage a family crisis without taking sides. "Maya, honey, I just got off the phone with Jessica. She's upset about your conversation." My mother paused, as if waiting for me to explain myself. When I remained silent, she continued. "She said you were angry about the graduation tickets and made her feel guilty about her achievement." The characterization was so removed from what had actually happened that I wondered if Jessica had deliberately misrepresented our conversation, or if she genuinely perceived my disappointment as an attack on her success. Either possibility was troubling, suggesting a level of disconnection between us that went far deeper than disagreements about graduation logistics. "Mom, I'm not angry about Jessica's achievement," I said carefully. "I'm hurt that she doesn't think I should be there to witness it, especially considering everything I've contributed to making it possible." My mother's sigh was audible through the phone. "Maya, you know Jessica appreciates what you've done, but graduation is her day, and she gets to decide how she wants to celebrate it. Maybe you could try to be more supportive instead of making this about yourself." The suggestion that I was making Jessica's graduation about myself felt like another rewriting of reality. I wasn't demanding to give a speech or receive recognition during the ceremony. I simply wanted to be present for a moment that represented the culmination of years of shared sacrifice and effort. But somehow, that desire had been transformed into selfishness and inappropriate focus on my own needs. "I've been supporting Jessica for 2 years," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I dropped out of school, worked multiple jobs, and lived like a monk so she could graduate debt-free. I'm not asking for credit or recognition. I just want to be there." My mother was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her tone was gentler, but still firmly aligned with Jessica's perspective. "Maya, no one forced you to make those choices. You're a grown woman who made decisions about your own life. Jessica didn't ask you to drop out of college or sacrifice your own education." The statement hit me like a slap. My own mother was echoing Jessica's narrative, suggesting that my sacrifices had been entirely voluntary, and that expecting inclusion in graduation was therefore inappropriate. The family I'd worked so hard to support was closing ranks against me, presenting a united front that positioned my hurt feelings as unreasonable and selfish. I ended the conversation shortly after, promising to think about what my mother had said and to call Jessica to apologize for upsetting her. But as I hung up, I realized I had no intention of apologizing for wanting to attend my sister's graduation after funding her education. If anything, I was beginning to understand that apologies had been flowing in the wrong direction for years. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. I alternated between anger at Jessica's dismissive attitude and self-doubt about whether I'd been unreasonable in my expectations. Had I really chosen to support her education without any implicit understanding that I would be included in important moments? Or had I been naive to assume that financial contributions would translate into emotional recognition and family inclusion? I found myself going through old text messages and emails, looking for evidence of how our arrangement had been established and maintained over the years. The early messages were revealing in their tone and content. Jessica's initial requests for help had been humble and grateful, filled with acknowledgments of my sacrifice and promises about future reciprocity. "Maya, I can't thank you enough for helping with tuition," read one message from her first semester. "I know this is a huge sacrifice for you, and I promise I'll make it up to you once I'm established in my career. You're literally making my dreams possible." Another message, sent during her first year, was even more explicit about our partnership. "I've been thinking about how much you've given up for my education, and I want you to know that I see this as an investment in both our futures. Once I'm earning a good salary, I'll help you finish your degree and start your own business. We're in this together." The contrast between those early messages and Jessica's recent attitude was stark. Somewhere along the way, her gratitude had transformed into entitlement, and her promises of future reciprocity had been forgotten entirely. The partnership she'd once acknowledged had become a one-way arrangement where I provided support, and she accepted it as her due. I spent hours reading through 2 years of correspondence, watching the evolution of Jessica's tone and language. The requests for help became shorter and less grateful over time. The acknowledgments of my sacrifice grew briefer and more perfunctory. By her final year, Jessica was simply informing me about upcoming expenses rather than asking for assistance, apparently confident that I would provide whatever she needed without question or complaint. The paper trail was damning, but it was also heartbreaking. I could see exactly when Jessica had stopped viewing me as a partner in her success and started seeing me as a resource to be managed. The transition had been gradual enough that I'd missed it in real time, focused as I was on meeting her immediate needs rather than examining the dynamics of our relationship. As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I realized that Jessica's graduation exclusion wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a systematic process of diminishing my role in her life while increasing my contributions to her success. She'd managed to position herself as the sole architect of her achievements while maintaining access to my financial and emotional support. The next morning brought no relief from the previous night's revelations. I woke up feeling exhausted despite having slept poorly. my dreams filled with anxious scenarios where I was repeatedly excluded from important family events. The graduation controversy had opened a wound that went far deeper than seating arrangements or ceremony logistics. I called in sick to work, something I'd rarely done in my years with Patricia's consulting firm. I needed time to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward with my relationship with Jessica and my own career goals. Patricia was understanding when I explained that I was dealing with a family crisis, offering to handle my client meetings and encouraging me to take whatever time I needed. The day stretched ahead of me, empty and unstructured in a way that felt both liberating and terrifying. For 2 years, my schedule had been dictated by the demands of supporting Jessica's education while building my own career. Every decision had been filtered through the lens of how it would affect my ability to provide financial assistance or whether it would conflict with her academic timeline. Now, for the first time in years, I had a day with no obligations to anyone else's dreams or needs. I could focus entirely on my own thoughts and feelings without worrying about how they might impact Jessica's success or my family's harmony. The freedom was intoxicating and overwhelming in equal measure. I spent the morning walking through my neighborhood in Southeast Portland, an area I'd chosen partly for its affordability and partly for its proximity to downtown where I worked. The streets were lined with small houses and apartment buildings that housed young professionals, artists, and service workers who couldn't afford the trendy neighborhoods closer to the city center. As I walked, I thought about the life I'd built here over the past 2 years. My apartment was small but comfortable, decorated with furniture I'd found at thrift stores and artwork I'd bought from local artists at weekend markets. I'd created a space that reflected my own tastes and interests, rather than simply serving as a place to sleep between work shifts. My job with Patricia had evolved into something that felt like a genuine career, rather than just a means of earning money to support Jessica. I'd developed skills in client relations, strategic planning, and business development that were transferable and valuable in their own right. Several clients had specifically requested my involvement in their projects, recognizing expertise that had nothing to do with my family connections or educational background. The consulting work had also connected me with Portland's small business community, introducing me to entrepreneurs and professionals who valued practical experience over academic credentials. I'd been invited to networking events, asked to speak at small business workshops, and consulted on projects that stretched my abilities and expanded my professional reputation. Yet somehow, none of these accomplishments felt real or significant when compared to Jessica's academic achievements. I'd internalized the family narrative that positioned her MBA as inherently more valuable than my practical experience, her theoretical knowledge as more impressive than my hands-on skills. Her exclusion of me from graduation had forced me to confront how little I valued my own professional development compared to hers. The walk through my neighborhood reminded me that I'd built a life in Portland that was entirely separate from my role as Jessica's financial supporter. I had friends from work and the local business community who knew nothing about my family dynamics or educational sacrifices. In their eyes, I was simply Maya Chen, successful consultant and valued colleague, not Jessica's sister who dropped out of college to fund someone else's dreams. The contrast between these two versions of myself was jarring. In Portland, I was competent and respected, sought after for my insights and appreciated for my contributions. In my family, I was the sister who'd made poor educational choices and whose primary value lay in her ability to provide financial support for more deserving relatives. I returned to my apartment with a new perspective on the graduation controversy. Jessica's exclusion wasn't really about limited seating or ceremony logistics. It was about maintaining the family narrative that positioned her as the successful daughter whose achievements deserved celebration and recognition. Including me in graduation would complicate that story by acknowledging the sacrifices that had made her success possible. In Jessica's version of events, she'd earned her MBA through her own hard work and determination, with minimal help from family members who'd chosen to support her out of generosity rather than obligation. My presence at graduation would serve as a reminder that her debt-free education had come at significant cost to someone else, undermining the narrative of self-made success she'd cultivated among her classmates and professors. The realization was painful, but also clarifying. I'd been expecting recognition and inclusion from someone who had strong incentives to minimize my contributions to her success. Jessica's career prospects would be enhanced by the appearance of independent achievement, while acknowledging my sacrifices would raise uncomfortable questions about the true cost of her education. That afternoon, I began making phone calls to gather information about completing my own education. I contacted Portland State's admissions office to inquire about re-enrollment procedures and credit transfer policies. I researched graduate programs in business and communications that would accept students with non-traditional educational backgrounds. I looked into professional certification programs that would enhance my consulting credentials without requiring full-time study. The conversations were encouraging in ways I hadn't expected. My work experience with Patricia's firm was viewed favorably by admissions counselors, who explained that non-traditional students often brought valuable perspectives to academic programs. Several programs offered flexible scheduling options, designed for working professionals, making it possible to pursue education while maintaining my career. More importantly, I discovered that my financial situation was better than I'd realized. 2 years of supporting Jessica's education had required careful budgeting and sacrifice, but it had also forced me to develop strong money management skills and build a career that provided stable income. Without the ongoing obligation to fund someone else's expenses, I could afford to invest in my own education while maintaining my current lifestyle. The financial analysis was both liberating and infuriating. I'd been living like a poverty-stricken student while earning a professional salary, directing most of my income toward Jessica's education and expenses. The money I'd sent her over 2 years would have been more than sufficient to complete my own undergraduate degree and begin graduate study. I'd made those financial choices willingly, motivated by love for my sister and belief in the importance of family support. But Jessica's dismissive attitude toward my sacrifices and her exclusion from graduation made it clear that my generosity hadn't been reciprocated with the gratitude or recognition I'd assumed would naturally follow. As evening approached, I found myself feeling lighter than I had in months. The hurt and anger from Jessica's phone call were still present, but they'd been joined by something else: determination to reclaim control over my own life and future. I'd spent 2 years prioritizing someone else's dreams over my own, and while I didn't regret helping Jessica achieve her goals, I was ready to start focusing on my own ambitions with equal intensity. I made a list of concrete steps I could take to advance my own career and education, starting with applications to programs I'd researched that day and expanding to include networking opportunities and professional development activities I'd been postponing. For the first time in years, my planning timeline extended beyond Jessica's graduation date to encompass goals that were entirely my own. The evening brought a text message from Jessica, apparently sent from her graduation celebration dinner. "Maya, I hope you're not still upset about the ticket situation. I know you understand that these things are complicated. Looking forward to celebrating with the family soon." The message's tone was cheerful and dismissive, treating our serious conversation as a minor misunderstanding that had already been resolved. Jessica apparently expected me to apologize for my reaction and return to my supportive role without further discussion of the underlying issues. Instead of responding immediately, I saved the message and returned to my planning documents. I'd spent enough energy trying to understand Jessica's perspective and manage her expectations. It was time to focus on my own needs and goals, with the same dedication I'd previously directed toward supporting her success. The day had been emotionally exhausting, but ultimately productive. I'd processed the hurt and disappointment of Jessica's exclusion while beginning to chart a course toward my own educational and professional goals. More importantly, I'd begun to separate my sense of self-worth from my role as Jessica's supporter. recognizing that my own achievements deserved the same recognition and celebration I'd been eager to provide for her success. As I prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my own future that wasn't contingent on someone else's approval or achievement. The feeling was foreign but welcome, like remembering a language I'd once spoken fluently, but had almost forgotten how to use. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions about how to move forward with my family relationships, while prioritizing my own growth and development. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, I fell asleep thinking about my own dreams rather than worrying about someone else's needs. 3 months after Jessica's graduation, I stood in the lobby of Portland State University's admissions building, holding an acceptance letter that felt heavier than any document I'd ever received. The university had not only accepted my application to return and complete my undergraduate degree, but they'd also offered me a partial scholarship based on my professional experience and academic potential. More importantly, they'd agreed to structure my course load around my consulting work, allowing me to pursue education without abandoning the career I'd built. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was returning to finish the degree I'd abandoned, to fund Jessica's MBA, using money I'd saved by no longer supporting her educational expenses. But what struck me most was how different this felt from my original college experience. 3 years ago, I'd been an uncertain student struggling to balance work and study while living paycheck to paycheck. Now, I was a confident professional, with clear goals and the financial stability to pursue them on my own terms. Patricia had been incredibly supportive when I'd explained my educational plans. Rather than seeing my return to school as a threat to our consulting partnership, she'd immediately begun discussing how my enhanced credentials could help us expand into new service areas and attract higher-profile clients. She'd even offered to adjust my work schedule and responsibilities to accommodate my class requirements, treating my education as an investment in our shared business future. The consulting firm had continued to grow throughout the summer, with client referrals keeping our calendar fully booked and revenue exceeding our most optimistic projections. I'd taken on increasing responsibility for business development and strategic planning, skills that felt natural and energizing in ways that classroom learning never had. The combination of practical experience and formal education promised to create opportunities I couldn't have imagined when I first dropped out of Portland State. Jessica had returned from graduation to begin her new job at a prestigious consulting firm in Seattle, a position that offered excellent starting salary and clear advancement potential. According to our parents, she was thriving in her new role, impressing supervisors with her analytical skills and business acumen. She'd moved into a downtown apartment and seemed to be building the successful professional life she'd always envisioned. We'd spoken briefly a few times since graduation, conversations that remained cordial but lacked the easy intimacy we'd once shared. Jessica never directly addressed our conflict about the graduation tickets, apparently assuming that time had resolved whatever hurt feelings I'd experienced. She spoke enthusiastically about her work and new city, occasionally mentioning networking events and career opportunities with the confidence of someone whose future stretched endlessly upward. I listened to these updates with genuine happiness for her success, but also with a growing sense of emotional distance that felt both sad and liberating. Jessica's achievements no longer felt like shared victories the way they had during her MBA program. They were her accomplishments, earned through her own efforts and deserving of recognition, but separate from my own life and goals in ways that felt healthier for both of us. The shift in our relationship dynamic had been gradual but unmistakable. Without the constant exchange of financial support and grateful acknowledgement that had characterized our interactions during her graduate school years, we'd discovered that we had less to talk about than either of us had realized. Jessica's world of corporate consulting and professional networking rarely intersected with my focus on small business development and local entrepreneurship. More significantly, I'd stopped seeking Jessica's approval or validation for my own choices and achievements. When I'd decided to return to school, I'd informed her of my plans rather than asking for her opinion. When clients praised my work, or offered new opportunities, I shared the news with Patricia and other professional colleagues rather than calling Jessica first. The emotional center of gravity in my life had shifted away from family dynamics toward my own goals and relationships. The change hadn't gone unnoticed by our parents, who seemed confused by the cooling of what had once been a close sisterly relationship. My mother occasionally asked if Jessica and I had argued about something, concerned by the decreased frequency of our phone calls and the polite but distant tone of our family gatherings. I assured her that nothing was wrong while avoiding detailed explanations of how our priorities and perspectives had diverged. In truth, nothing was wrong in the way my mother meant. Jessica and I hadn't fought or said hurtful things to each other. We simply no longer shared the assumption that her dreams should take precedence over mine, or that my role was primarily to support her ambitions rather than pursue my own. The revelation had been quietly revolutionary, transforming not just our relationship, but my entire approach to family loyalty and personal sacrifice. The fall semester at Portland State began with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of my original freshman year, but with crucial differences. This time, I knew exactly why I was there and what I hoped to accomplish. My course load focused on business administration and communications, subjects that complemented my consulting experience while filling gaps in my theoretical knowledge. Unlike my younger classmates, I approached each assignment with the practical perspective of someone who'd already applied these concepts in real business situations. My professors quickly recognized that I brought a different perspective to classroom discussions, often asking me to share insights from my consulting work or connect theoretical frameworks to actual business challenges. Rather than feeling intimidated by my non-traditional path, I found that my professional experience enhanced my academic performance in ways I hadn't anticipated. The other students in my program were a mix of traditional college seniors and returning adults who'd interrupted their education for various reasons. I connected particularly well with the non-traditional students, who understood the challenge of balancing coursework with established careers and adult responsibilities. We formed study groups that met in coffee shops and co-working spaces rather than dormitory lounges, approaching our education with the focused intensity of people who'd chosen to be there rather than simply following expected paths. One of my classmates, Maria Santos, had returned to school after spending 5 years managing her family's restaurant while her younger brother completed culinary school. Her story resonated with mine in ways that made our friendship feel both natural and healing. Maria understood the complexity of family sacrifice and the difficulty of reclaiming personal ambitions after years of supporting someone else's dreams. The hardest part, Maria told me during one of our study sessions, was realizing that I'd been waiting for permission to focus on myself. Like I needed my brother to explicitly release me from my support role before I could pursue my own goals. Her observation captured something I'd been struggling to articulate about my own experience with Jessica. Through conversations with Maria and other returning students, I began to understand that my situation wasn't unique or particularly dramatic. Many families operated with unspoken agreements about who would sacrifice for whom, often based on assumptions about potential rather than explicit discussions about fairness or reciprocity. The pattern was common enough that several of my classmates had similar stories about deferring their own education or career goals to support siblings who seemed more likely to achieve conventional success. What made my situation different wasn't the sacrifice itself, but Jessica's apparent inability to acknowledge the cost of my support or include me meaningfully in her success. The graduation exclusion had been a symptom of a deeper problem. Jessica had genuinely come to believe that her achievements were entirely self-generated, despite the financial foundation that had made them possible. The realization helped me process my hurt feelings without getting stuck in anger or resentment. Jessica wasn't deliberately cruel or manipulative. She'd simply absorbed a narrative about individual achievement that made it difficult for her to recognize interdependence and support. Her worldview emphasized personal responsibility and self-reliance in ways that rendered my contributions invisible, not through malice, but through genuine inability to see beyond the framework of individual success. Understanding Jessica's perspective didn't eliminate my disappointment, but it did help me move forward without waiting for acknowledgement that might never come. I could appreciate her achievements while also recognizing my own contributions and building a life that didn't depend on her validation or inclusion. As the semester progressed, I threw myself into my studies with enthusiasm I'd never felt during my original college experience. Business strategy courses connected directly to challenges I was addressing with consulting clients. Communications classes enhanced skills I used daily in client presentations and proposal writing. Marketing coursework provided theoretical frameworks for approaches I'd developed intuitively through trial and error. The integration of academic learning with practical experience created a synergy that accelerated both my educational progress and my professional development. Professors began recommending me for internships and research opportunities that would have been competitive for traditional students, but were perfect fits for someone with my background. I found myself being recruited for leadership roles in student organizations and invited to speak at campus events about entrepreneurship and non-traditional career paths. By mid-semester, I was thriving academically while also expanding my consulting practice beyond the partnership with Patricia. Several clients had approached me about taking on larger projects that would require dedicated focus and significant time investment. The opportunities were exactly what I'd been working toward. Chances to build my own business reputation while developing expertise in areas that genuinely interested me. The success felt different from the vicarious pride I'd experienced during Jessica's academic achievements. This was personal satisfaction earned through my own efforts, recognition that belonged entirely to me rather than being shared with or attributed to family members. The distinction was subtle but profound, marking a fundamental shift in how I understood my own capabilities and potential. During Thanksgiving break, I returned to Beaverton for the first extended family gathering since Jessica's graduation. She'd driven down from Seattle for the holiday, bringing stories about her new job and life in the city. The conversation around the dinner table focused primarily on her professional accomplishments and social activities, with our parents asking detailed questions about her work projects and weekend plans. When the discussion turned to my own updates, I mentioned my return to school and the growth of my consulting business. The response was polite, but notably less enthusiastic than the attention Jessica's achievements had received. My mother asked practical questions about graduation timelines and course requirements, while my father wondered aloud whether I might eventually consider more stable employment than consulting work. The contrast in their reactions was revealing but no longer painful in the way it once would have been. I'd stopped expecting my family to understand or celebrate my choices with the same intensity they brought to Jessica's conventional success. Markers. Their lukewarm response to my achievements said more about their values and assumptions than about the objective worth of what I'd accomplished. Jessica seemed genuinely pleased to hear about my educational plans, though her questions focused primarily on how my degree might help me get a better job, rather than the intrinsic value of learning or personal growth. She spoke about my consulting work in terms that minimized its significance compared to her corporate position, referring to my clients as small businesses in a tone that suggested limited importance or potential. The conversation reminded me of how thoroughly Jessica had internalized hierarchies that valued certain types of success over others. Her MBA and corporate consulting role occupied higher rungs on a ladder that positioned my practical experience and entrepreneurial work as less impressive stepping stones toward more legitimate achievements. She wasn't intentionally dismissive. She simply couldn't see beyond the framework that had shaped her own ambitions and self-worth. After dinner, Jessica and I walked through our old neighborhood, past houses where we'd grown up playing with friends and riding bicycles on summer afternoons. The conversation was pleasant, but surface level, focusing on changes in the area and updates about mutual acquaintances, rather than anything personal or meaningful about our current lives. At one point, Jessica mentioned that her Seattle apartment, was expensive but worth it for the location and networking opportunities. She described weekend social events with colleagues and the professional connections she was building through work-related activities. Her life sounded exciting and purposeful, filled with the kind of opportunities she'd always envisioned for herself. I shared updates about my own work and studies, but noticed that Jessica's attention seemed to drift when I discussed client projects or academic achievements that didn't directly relate to her own experiences. She responded with polite interest, but without the engaged curiosity that characterizes genuine concern for someone else's well-being and success. The realization wasn't bitter or angry, just clear. Jessica cared about me in the abstract way that family members care about each other, but she wasn't particularly interested in the details of my life or invested in my success beyond hoping that I was generally happy and financially stable. Our relationship had become cordial but distant, lacking the emotional intimacy I'd once assumed would always connect us. As we walked back toward our parents' house, I felt a sense of closure about the graduation controversy and the broader pattern it had represented. Jessica's exclusion of me from her ceremony hadn't been a temporary lapse in judgment or a moment of thoughtless cruelty. It had been an accurate reflection of how she viewed our relationship. I was peripheral to her important moments, valuable as a supporter, but not essential as a witness or participant. The understanding was liberating rather than devastating. I could stop hoping for acknowledgement that wasn't coming and focus instead on building relationships with people who valued my contributions and celebrated my achievements. Jessica would always be my sister, but she didn't need to be my primary source of validation or my closest confidant. The spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities that required my full attention and energy. I'd been selected for a competitive internship with a business development nonprofit that worked with women entrepreneurs, a position that combined my academic coursework with my consulting experience while introducing me to a community of professionals who shared my interests and values. The internship supervisor, Dr. Amanda Chen, noticed immediately that we shared a surname and asked about my family background. When I mentioned having a sister who'd recently completed her MBA, Dr. Chen asked follow-up questions about Jessica's career path that revealed she was familiar with the Seattle consulting firm where Jessica worked. "Your sister must be very driven to land a position there straight out of graduate school," Dr. Chen observed. "Those firms are extremely selective about their hiring, and they typically look for candidates who've demonstrated exceptional leadership and initiative." I agreed that Jessica was indeed driven and had worked hard to achieve her goals. But, for the first time in such a conversation, I didn't feel compelled to detail my own contributions to her success or seek indirect recognition for the sacrifices that had made her achievements possible. Jessica's accomplishments belonged to her, just as my own developing success belonged to me. The distinction felt healthy and mature in ways that surprised me. I'd spent so many years defining myself in relation to Jessica's achievements that developing an independent sense of professional identity required conscious effort and practice. But gradually, I was learning to appreciate my own work and progress without constantly comparing them to someone else's trajectory or seeking external validation for choices that felt right to me. By the end of the academic year, I'd completed my undergraduate degree with honors, while also expanding my consulting practice to include clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. Several professors had encouraged me to consider graduate school, pointing out that my combination of academic performance and professional experience would make me competitive for top-tier business programs. The suggestion was tempting, but I'd learned to make educational decisions based on my own goals rather than external expectations or family patterns. If I pursued graduate study, it would be because advanced education served my specific career objectives. Not because advanced degrees were inherently more valuable than practical experience, or because Jessica had set a precedent I felt obligated to follow. The consulting business continued to thrive, with Patricia and I discussing plans to hire additional staff and expand into new service areas where demand exceeded our current capacity. I'd also been approached by several organizations about board positions and speaking opportunities that would raise my professional profile while contributing to causes I cared about. Most importantly, I'd begun to see my professional work as genuinely meaningful rather than simply a means of earning money or achieving conventional success markers. The small businesses I worked with were creating jobs, serving their communities, and building economic vitality in ways that felt more personally significant than the corporate consulting projects Jessica described with such enthusiasm. The difference in our values and priorities had become increasingly clear over the months since her graduation. Jessica thrived in environments that emphasized competition, hierarchical advancement, and quantifiable achievement metrics. I was drawn to collaborative work that emphasized relationship building, creative problem solving, and sustainable growth over rapid expansion. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they reflected fundamentally different assumptions about success and fulfillment that explained why our relationship had become strained when my role shifted from supporter to independent actor. As long as I was facilitating Jessica's ambitions, our different values didn't conflict. Once I began pursuing my own goals, the distinctions became impossible to ignore. During the summer after graduation, I made a decision that felt both natural and momentous. I declined to attend Jessica's birthday celebration in Seattle, choosing instead to attend a business conference that would advance my own professional development. The choice represented a clear prioritization of my own needs over family obligations, something I couldn't have imagined doing during the years when I was supporting Jessica's education. Jessica's reaction to my absence was polite disappointment rather than hurt surprise, suggesting that she'd also adjusted to our changed relationship dynamic. She sent photos from the celebration and thanked me for the gift I'd mailed but didn't press for detailed explanations about why I'd chosen work over family time. The conference was exactly what I'd hoped. 3 days of intensive workshops, networking opportunities, and presentations by successful entrepreneurs who'd built businesses similar to what I envisioned for my own future. I returned to Portland, energized and full of ideas for expanding my consulting practice, while also beginning to develop products and services that could scale beyond individual client relationships. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since Jessica's graduation controversy, I realized how thoroughly my life had been transformed by the experience. The hurt and disappointment I'd felt about being excluded from her ceremony had catalyzed changes that improved virtually every aspect of my personal and professional situation. I'd completed my undergraduate degree, expanded my business, developed new friendships with people who shared my interests and values, and most importantly, learned to prioritize my own goals without guilt or apology. The woman who'd sat in her small apartment feeling devastated by Jessica's casual dismissal had evolved into someone confident enough to make choices based on her own judgment rather than family expectations. The transformation hadn't required dramatic confrontations or permanent estrangement from Jessica and my parents. Instead, it had involved gradual shifts in priorities and boundaries that allowed me to maintain family relationships while also protecting my own well-being and ambitions. I still cared deeply about Jessica's success and happiness, but I no longer felt responsible for facilitating them at the expense of my own development. The balance felt sustainable in ways that my previous approach never had. Rather than oscillating between self-sacrifice and resentment, I'd found ways to be supportive that didn't compromise my own goals or diminish my sense of personal worth. Jessica could succeed or struggle based on her own efforts and choices, while I focused on building the life and career that aligned with my own values and aspirations. Standing in my expanded office space on a crisp October morning, surrounded by evidence of professional growth and personal achievement, I felt grateful for the painful lesson Jessica's graduation had taught me. Her exclusion had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about our relationship and my own patterns of self-sacrifice, ultimately leading to changes that benefited everyone involved. Jessica was thriving in her chosen career without needing constant support and validation from family members. My parents had adjusted to having two independent daughters rather than one successful child and one devoted supporter. And I'd discovered capabilities and ambitions I might never have pursued if I'd remained comfortable in my supporting role. The phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was a potential client calling about a major project that would challenge my skills while significantly expanding my business reach. As I answered the call with enthusiasm and confidence, I realized that this was exactly where I was meant to be, building my own success story rather than enabling someone else's dreams. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.